some 200 years, the British Navy was the most powerful in the world. It was instrumental in establishing the British Empire as the dominant world power from the beginning of the 19th century until the Second World War. Its origins go back many hundreds of years, and in the 21st century the historically smaller Royal Navy continues to play a crucial role on the international stage. Throughout its history, Dorset was a tranquil pastoral county with no great towns or industries to attract particular attention from would-be aggressors. However, the security of the adjoining English Channel has always been vital to the nation, and Dorset's coastline was vulnerable. It was a soft place to attack, with many undefended landing places. The Romans invaded these shores, and in 789 the Vikings made their first attack on the British mainland at Portland. France and Spain were the traditional enemies of Great Britain for centuries, and rivalry and posturing by respective leaders compounded the friction which arose all too frequently. In 1538 the fear of invasion peaked, and Henry VIII ordered a chain of new fortifications to be built along the south coast, including Portland Castle 1539 and Sandsfoot Castle 1541, to protect the Portland roads, which was well established as an important haven for all types of shipping. By the time of Henry's death in 1547, the country had a powerful naval fleet of 58 vessels, which regularly sailed past the Dorset coast and took advantage of its natural havens, especially the naturally sheltered lee side of Portland and Weymouth. The great strategist Walter Raleigh knew the importance of Portland roads, and in 1587 he urged Queen Elizabeth's chief adviser, Lord Burleigh, to strengthen its defences. Spain had now become the leading naval power in Europe. The Spanish both feared and despised anti-Catholic England and its Protestant Queen. In 1588 they dispatched their Great Armada to destroy the English fleet. The Armada was first sighted off the Scilly Isles by Captain Fleming on the barque Golden Hind on the 29th of July 1588. Beacons were lit along the coast. The Armada ploughed on up the channel in a huge crescent formation. This was a time of profound change in sea warfare. The outmoded Spanish galleons were cumbersome and awkward to sail. The English ships were of a new advanced design, smaller, faster and much more manoeuvrable. Dorset was now to witness one of the great engagements between the Spanish and the English. Lord Howard chased the Armada up the channel, catching up with them off Portland Bill. In a fresh wind the ships tried to outmanoeuvre each other, and the boom of their gunfire carried easily to Weymouth. "Never was heard a greater thundering of ordnance on both sides," wrote Camden. By the end of the day-long Battle of Portland, the English had run out of ammunition, but the Spanish, although not yet crushed, had been decisively routed. The Spanish Armada, of course, was eventually defeated by the English and Dutch fleets and by the weather. By 1652, tensions were rising between England and the new Dutch Republic over territorial control along the English Channel. The Dutch Navy sought to command the vital trading routes, but they met their match in February 1653. The English fleet had been refitted and reorganised, and 65 ships put to sea under Admirals Blake, Dean and Monk. Off Portland they sighted Van Tromp's 80-strong Dutch fleet, protecting a convoy of 200 merchantmen. In this three-day battle off Dorset, the Dutch suffered 5 sunken warships, 2 burnt and 4 captured. Up to 50 of the 200 merchant ships in the convoy were taken. The English navy was victorious. Admiral Sir William Penn, who commanded the Speaker in the Battle of Portland, became MP for Weymouth in 1660. His son William became the founder of Pennsylvania, USA, and his wealthy great-grandson, John Penn, built the luxurious Pennsylvania Castle in 1800 on a Portland clifftop, overlooking the site of his ancestors' sea battle. In the early 18th century, the British Navy had more ships than any other nation, but France under Napoleon Bonaparte was becoming increasingly belligerent and declared war on Britain in 1793. Napoleon sought to invade Egypt as the first step in a campaign against British India. The result was the Battle of the Nile of 1798, the most decisive naval engagement of the great age of sail. News of Rear Admiral Lord Nelson's historic victory off Egypt reached King George III during one of his many summers in Weymouth with his family. This called for royal celebrations, so on the 8th of October the decks of the San Fiorenzo in Portland Roads were cleared for a grand celebratory dance. All the naval ships in the anchorage were dressed overall. Hostilities with French lasted for 9 years. Fighting lulled in 1802 but soon flared up with the Napoleonic Wars. Thereafter the British Empire, with its Royal Navy, became the world's greatest power. There was no naval base between the ports of Portsmouth and Plymouth, but at times up to 140 vessels could be seen assembled in the vast area of water sheltered in most winds by the huge bulk of Portland Peninsula, the Chesilbank and Weymouth. Dorset has a long and proud seafaring tradition. Although not populous, many of her sons have played a sturdy part in England's maritime history. Countless men and officers who'd served and died for their country are now forgotten. Others rose to high rank and national fame. The famous Hood dynasty had strong connections with Dorset. The Reverend Samuel Hood, Vicar of Thorncombe, was the father of 2 outstanding naval sons, Samuel and Alexander. Samuel joined the Navy in 1740 and progressed right up to Admiral. In 1780, Admiral Hood sailed in command of a squadron to America at the time of their War of Independence. Samuel's younger brother, Alexander, served in the Mediterranean and in the English Channel. He finished an illustrious career as Admiral Alexander Hood, Lord Bridport. Henry Digby was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1819, Vice Admiral in 1830, and in 1841 became an Admiral. Digby commanded HMS Africa in the memorable action off Trafalgar, 1805. Some 180 Dorset men served in the Battle of Trafalgar. The famous sea battle on the 21st of October 1805 was fought off the southwest coast of Spain, just west of Cape Trafalgar. 27 British ships of the line, led by Admiral Lord Nelson aboard HMS Victory, roundly defeated the French and Spanish fleets. The Franco-Spanish force lost 22 ships, without a single British vessel being lost. Commanding the 100-gun Victory was Nelson's longtime friend, Dorset's Thomas Masterman Hardy. He was Nelson's right-hand man in major conflicts, culminating in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Hardy, Nelson and King George III were all in Dorset when they first learned of the massing of Napoleon's fleet. On the 15th of September 1805, Hardy set sail on HMS Victory from Portsmouth with Nelson on board, and a month later the fleet confronted Napoleon's navy near Cadiz. That great sea battle needs no retelling here, but the victorious Victory struggled home against a strong gale, and it was a week before Hardy could write to his brother-in-law, J.C. Manfield of Dorchester, to relate the tragic news of Nelson's death. Admiral Hardy died in 1839. His fine Portesham Dorset home still looks much as it did when he lived there until his marriage in 1807. To commemorate his achievements, an octagonal 22-metre-high tower known as Hardy's Monument was erected on Blackdown Hill above Portesham in 1844. It was an invaluable landmark for mariners at sea. 135 miles separated the ports of Portsmouth and Plymouth. Portland roadstead offered tremendous prospects as a place of refuge, if only it could be protected from southeasterly gales. The most dynamic period in Dorset's association with the Royal Navy was without question the 150 years following the formation of Portland Harbour and the departure of the Royal Navy from the area near the close of the 20th century. The scheme to create a harbour from Portland roadstead was of a stupendous scale, and the development had a major social and economic impact throughout Dorset. The first serious proposal to form a harbour of the roadstead was made in 1794 by John Harvey of Weymouth, but it was not until 1843 that things finally got moving. In 1844, Commander William L. Sheringham was ordered to make a full survey of the Weymouth and Portland roads. Arriving in his 165-ton wooden paddle steamer HMS Fearless, he undertook a detailed hydrographic survey, sounding the entire anchorage and measuring its tides and streams. The scheme for a massive breakwater finally won the determined support of the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel. The project to create a vast harbour from Portland roads thus moved forward. James Rendell of Plymouth was appointed Engineer-in-Chief for the project. In August 1846, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert experienced first-hand the need for a breakwater at Portland. Their royal yacht had to put into the roads in a storm, but it was too rough for the Queen to land. The Portland breakwaters eventually created the largest man-made harbour in the world. With its associated defences, the mighty Verne Citadel, the landward gun batteries, the Nothe Fort, and the Breakwater Fort, it was a national project of monumental scale. During more than half a century of construction, this was at times Victorian Britain's biggest and most expensive government-funded engineering scheme. When the Portland breakwaters were conceived, naval ships were powered by the wind and steam was still a novelty. Nobody then could imagine the phenomenal changes that science and technology would bring to the maritime world. Neither did anyone contemplate the shifting of the perceived enemy from Spain and France to Russia and then to Germany at the end of the 19th century. The Crimean War, 1853-56, led to a radical change in ship design. Initial resistance to the armouring of ships' hulls was overcome. Screw-driven steamships had now proven far superior to either paddles or sail. The striking figurehead of HMS Basilisk stood at the entrance to Portland Naval Base in its latter years. The steam paddler Basilisk took part in an historic trial of power with the screw ship HMS Niger in June 1849. Tied stern to stern in the English Channel, the Niger decisively proved the superiority of screw propulsion over paddles. A big advantage of the Portland anchorage was the small tidal range, some 2 metres at spring tides, and the flat seabed unencumbered by rocks. Only mobility on a national scale could support work of the magnitude required. The solution was to establish a convict colony on Portland, where prisoners sentenced to transportation would quarry the vast quantities of stone required for the breakwater. HM steamship Driver delivered hundreds of convicts for the government works on Portland in late 1848. The convicts were landed at Castletown and escorted to their new cliff-top prison. The Driver had made history the year before by being the first steam vessel to circumnavigate the globe. And incidentally, HMS Driver brought my great-great-grandfather back from the Crimea in 1856. The Portland breakwater scheme captured the technical and scientific mind of Victoria's consort, Prince Albert. Amid great celebrations, he arrived to lay the ceremonial stone on the 25th of July, 1849. Over the next 12 years, Albert made several informal visits to see the progress. Within 5 years, Sir John Burgoyne, the Inspector General of Fortifications, confirmed that the embryo Portland Harbour already afforded good shelter to men of war, as well as to merchantmen. But should there be a war, it is totally without defences. He proposed that the commanding hill of the Verne above the harbour be converted into a very strong citadel, for its security against attack by land. A great expansion of the Cherbourg naval base had been the focus of fears of invasion of the Dorset coast for 50 years. However, as Portland grew in strength and importance, the rapid changes in warfare technology reduced the effectiveness of Cherbourg. The Navy was quick to take advantage of the growing sheltered sector in Portland Roads, even while the breakwater was only a fraction completed. In late 1854 some 100 ships anchored there. In 1856 the Lords of the Admiralty arrived at Portland on the Black Eagle to inspect the 70-ton screw ship HMS Sans-Pareil, which was accompanied by 41 gunboats and HMS Colossus. The Colossus was always an impressive sight in Portland Roads and towered above the little gunboats. Her later years were spent as the Portland Guard ship until being broken up in 1867. Life on board ships of the Royal Navy was changing too. Regulation uniforms arrived in 1857, and in 1860 compulsory death sentences were reduced from 10 offences to 2, treason and murder. Flogging ceased to be a punishment at the captain's discretion and officially ended altogether in the 1870s. The main breakwater fort was an enormous structure, an awesome feat of engineering, standing in 70 feet of water on a 400-foot wide column of 140,000 tons of granite and limestone. The heavily armed fortress contained officers' quarters, an inner court, a barrack room, and its own miniature jetty. In March 1859, the Admiralty gave directions that all newly commissioned ships were to assemble at Portland prior to joining the Channel Squadron. Rapid changes were taking place in the propulsion of naval ships, but in 1860 steam was still auxiliary to sail. The British Navy now had 518 vessels, many of which were doing duty in every part of the globe. Of the 65 line-of-battle ships, frigates, sloops and gunboats, 19 were attached to the Channel Squadron, which was frequently at Portland. The epoch of the iron-hulled steamship arrived with the launching in 1860 of HMS Warrior. With her, the British roundly trumped France's new but smaller and less powerful La Gloire, the first ocean-going ironclad battleship. The revolutionary Warrior was a frequent visitor to Portland in the 1860s. She was Portsmouth-based, but most years she was in Dorset for extended periods. Warrior had a huge appetite for coal, and Portland struggled to provide her, even with the 4,000-ton capacity of the great coaling shed. Warrior, of course, is now preserved at Portsmouth. Just 14 years after her launch, the famous HMS Warrior took up station as Portland's Coast Guard ship in 1875. At her launch, Warrior was by far the largest, fastest and most heavily armoured warship ever. But she was now outdated. Just 6 years separated her from HMS Bellerophon, the first Royal Naval ship to carry a balanced rudder. It took 40 men 90 seconds to apply full helm on the Warrior. The same on the Bellerophon took only 8 men just 27 seconds. The twin 1.6-mile-long breakwaters now sheltered the largest man-made harbour in the world, over 2,000 acres. The chief engineer for the bulk of the work was John Coode, who was knighted in 1872 for his 25 years' work at Portland. And on the 10th of August 1872, the Prince of Wales came to declare the works complete, in one of the greatest celebrations Dorset has ever seen. The Channel and Reserve squadrons assembled in the harbour, headed by 15 huge ironclads. Amid royal salutes, the Prince of Wales arrived aboard the Victoria and Albert to lay the last stone. After the state barge had brought him ashore, the Portland Artillery Band struck up in front of the Admiralty offices, and children sang "God Bless the Prince of Wales" on the grass banks above. Portland now had a world-class anchorage where soon up to 200 ships at a time could be accommodated. It had a larger area of deep water than any other harbour in Great Britain. Throughout that period, visitors were often welcomed aboard to inspect the huge guns and engines of the latest vessels, such as the turret ship HMS Thunderer of 1872. She was the sister ship to the twin-screw turret ship HMS Devastation, a prototype of the 20th century battleship and the Navy's first capital ship with no rigging. The iconic image of Devastation featured on England's Glory matchboxes. After her launch in 1873, Devastation arrived at Portland for trials. Steaming off the Dorset coast, she was subjected to rolling trials broadside to wind and waves. The turret ship HMS Glatton was involved in an unusual firing trial in 1873. She was securely anchored fore and aft as a living target for the ironclad Hotspur, which incidentally had a heavy ram fitted to her bow. The Hotspur's heavy gun fired directly at Glatton's turret to test its ability to withstand shell impact, and the damage was manageable. Portland had now become indispensable for the Royal Navy. The Admiralty regarded as one of the most important places in the United Kingdom for our battleships, and the Dorset coast was regularly used for naval manoeuvres, trials and exercises in late Victorian times. The big ironclads frequenting the harbour in the 1880s carried some of the heaviest guns ever mounted at sea. In January 1862, the training ship Britannia, the nursery for our future admirals, had arrived at Portland. After 3 years she was transferred to Dartmouth, which later won a battle with Portland for the prestigious Naval College. In 1866, Britannia's moorings at Portland were taken by HMS Boscawen, a three-decked sailing ship of the line launched in 1844. She had seen action in the Crimea, now restored as a training ship for boy seamen. Lads keen to join the Navy had to be 14 to 16 years old and over a minimum height and chest size. They had to be able to read and write fairly, be strong, healthy, well-grown, active, intelligent, free from all physical malformation, and must never have had fits. The 500 boys on Boscawen were pushed to their limits, but training had not caught up with the age of steam and the ironclads. Initially, it still reflected life at sea under sail. Climbing to the topmast to set rigging took nerve for 14 to 16-year-olds. 10 years later, the boys of the now ageing training ship Boscawen were transferred to an even older HMS Trafalgar, one of the wooden walls of Old England, now back in her familiar waters. The name Boscawen was transferred to the Trafalgar. The last sailing ship built for the Royal Navy was the training brig Seaflower, which was launched in 1873. She arrived at Portland in 1879 along with the brig Martin as tenders for the Boscawen. In 1893, the training ship Boscawen was joined at her moorings by HMS Agincourt and her sister ship Minotaur as training ships. Both had been frequent visitors to Portland. As the faded Agincourt lay stationary in the harbour for 12 years, few may have remembered that during her active career she was the flagship of no less than 15 admirals, some of whom were among the most notable figures of Victorian naval history. The Minotaur of 1863, too, had a distinguished service. From 1867 she was the flagship of the Channel Fleet, and she served the Navy in various roles for nearly 60 years. Nearest here in 1873 is the training ship HMS Boscawen. Next is the Portland Guard ship HMS Achilles, an iron screw ship of improved design based on HMS Warrior. Behind is HMS Minotaur. These training ships imparted strong life and sea skills to thousands of youths who trod their decks. However, following allegations of birching and brutal treatment aboard, the ships were removed in 1906. The late Victorian Royal Navy had little experience of real conflict. This 1896 drill for repelling boarders with swords and wooden bats strikes a contrast with the ship's great guns. Nothing had a more profound effect on naval warfare in the second half of the 19th century than the development of the torpedo. In 1866, Robert Whitehead produced a prototype torpedo propelled by compressed air. The Admiralty saw its potential, and later a greenfield site at White Regis on the northwest shore of Portland Harbour was found to be the ideal location for Whitehead's new factory, which opened in 1891. Torpedo trials in the harbour caused many accidents, as in 1904 when a Norwegian freighter was struck by a blank torpedo whilst crossing the range. The first battleship to be fitted with torpedo tubes was HMS Inflexible of 1876. The first proper torpedo boat destroyers, the Havoc and the Hornet of 1893, attained world record speeds of 27 knots. The development of the torpedo undermined previous notions of the defence of ships in port. It was a new and deadly potential threat to hundreds of warship and merchantmen frequenting the harbour. There was only one solution for Portland. A physical barrier had to be built across the 2-mile gap between the Breakwater fort and the Weymouth shore at Bincleaves. A scheme to fully enclose the harbour was given the go-ahead in 1894. Here the pre-dreadnought Majestic-class battleships anchor at Portland around 1898. They were distinguished by having funnels 2 abreast instead of the usual 4 and aft. Beyond is the line of 12 dolphins, 12 temporary artificial islands, between which anti-submarine cables were strung, pending the completion of the breakwaters themselves. The new northern breakwater joined the Weymouth shore at Bincleaves, and a lighthouse was erected on the outer head. After more than half a century, the 4-mile string of breakwaters was thus finally complete. A new coaling pier with gigantic hydraulic machinery was completed in 1907, but technology had overtaken events. Newer ships were now oil-powered, so a range of big oil fuel tanks was planned at the Mere, near the southwest corner of the harbour. By the turn of the 20th century, with the advent of torpedoes, submarines and the impending aircraft, all the grandiose and expensive defences built in South Dorset since Palmerston's day had become obsolete. The first British submarine was launched in November 1901, and within 3 years ships from Portland were exercising in mock wars against submarines. It took some time for the Admiralty to realise that they were a force to be reckoned with. The brief 9-year Edwardian period was a time of phenomenal change, with the rapid progression in the design and production of British submarines, warship and aircraft. The yet-to-be-crowned Edward VII arrived at Portland Harbour on the 3rd of April 1902, unannounced. A small gathering of onlookers was surprised to see the King stepping off a blue-hulled barge and walk briskly to Castletown Pier. From there, sporting his sailing cap, he took an open carriage to the convict prison, and from the heights he looked back over the magnificent panorama of the fleet in the harbour and Weymouth Bay. Everything was now so different from the time of the King's first visit to the area in 1872, when, as the Prince of Wales, he laid the ceremonial last stone for the breakwater. The glorious scenes of naval ships with black hulls, white upperworks and yellow funnels were changing. From 1905, the new livery was Battleship Grey. Portland Harbour was now a hub of naval activity. Flotillas of torpedo boat destroyers were herded into special pens near Castletown. Conditions on board them were cramped, so the crews were given special concessions. Their tot of rum was issued neat instead of being watered down, as was the regulation. In 1907, Lord Charles Beresford became Commander-in-Chief in HMS King Edward VII at Portland. Under his command, the Channel Fleet composed 14 battleships and various armoured cruisers. In time of war, it was planned that Beresford would be given supreme command over all 244 fighting vessels of the Navy. However, this was peacetime, and there were 3 commanders-in-chief in home waters, a recipe for friction and personality clashes at the top. In one incident, the cruiser Good Hope was undertaking gunnery practice off Lulworth Cove, when Beresford ordered it back to harbour for sprucing up for a visit of the Kaiser. Rear Admiral Sir Percy Scott on the Good Hope relayed the curt signal, "As paintwork appears to be more important than gunnery, "You are to return to harbour to make yourselves look pretty." Beresford was livid. Here is a remarkable 1907 photograph of Lord Charles Beresford with Admiral Percy Scott Wright, apparently in good spirits after having given a pep talk at the new Fleet Canteen, Castletown. Intense firing exercises by the new big-gunned battleships were now causing noise and vibration ashore. Complaints from villages along the Dorset coast and even from Bournemouth were dismissed with little sympathy from the Admiralty. An action-packed 3 days awaited George V at Weymouth and Portland in May 1912. The King arrived on the Victoria and Albert with his cadet naval son, Prince Albert, later George VI, along with the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, and the Second Sea Lord, Admiral Prince Louis of Battenberg. They witnessed a spectacular array of Britain's greatest warships assembled for the naval review. In 6 lines of warships were 28 battleships, 3 battlecruisers, 11 heavy cruisers, 7 flotillas of 33-knot destroyers, and nearly 50 submarines. Portland had become the principal submarine and anti-submarine base, and despite its slow start, Britain now had more submarines than any other nation. The pre-dreadnought Hibernia had been fitted with a launching platform and arrived with 4 planes aboard. Commander Charles Sansom took off in his short S-27 biplane from the Hibernia, steaming at 10.5 knots. This was the first ever successful take-off from a moving ship at sea. 29-year-old Sansom was described as a little short man with a real naval beard and a fine flow of language. But he proved himself a superb aviator. His colleague, Arthur Longmore, was in 1914 the first to test the dropping of torpedoes from aircraft, and he went on to win a knighthood and become an RAF Air Chief Marshal. The Royal Flying Corps had been established only 3 weeks previous to the Royal Review. As the Royal Naval Air Service, it became under the control of the Royal Navy in 1915. Anglo-German relations had been deteriorating since the turn of the 20th century. Under the First Sea Lord, Sir John Fisher, ship design was revolutionised. Gunfire range increased from 3,000 to 10,000 yards, and in 1906 the powerful Dreadnought was launched. With its 10 12-inch guns, a displacement of 18,000 tons, and a speed of 21 knots, there was nothing at sea to match it. The megalomaniac Kaiser Wilhelm II was furious, and the Germans responded by ratcheting up their ship design and construction to unprecedented levels. The outcome of this naval arms race quickly became apparent when war was declared on August 4, 1914. A month earlier, the 460 ships of the home fleets gathered at Portland. Churchill later recollected it constituted incomparably the greatest assemblage of naval power ever assembled in the history of the world. Churchill soon realised that such a concentration of warships at Portland presented a tempting target for preemptive strike by German destroyers. On his own volition, without consulting anybody, Churchill informed the King that the First Fleet will sail secretly tomorrow for its preliminary northern station. So the fleet set sail for Scapa Flow and Rosyth at 0700 on 29th of July 1914. In his masterly turn of phrase, Churchill later recalled, "We may now picture this great fleet, with its flotillas and cruisers, steaming slowly out of Portland Harbour, squadron by squadron, scores of gigantic castles of steel wending their way across the misty, shining sea, like giants bowed in anxious thought. We may picture them again as darkness fell, 18 miles of warship running at high speed and in absolute blackness through the narrow straits, bearing with them into the broad waters of the north the safeguard of our considerable affairs. The King's ships were at sea." Here we can see a youthful Prince Albert, later King George VI, on HMS Neptune at Portland. His father, George V, is on the left. The Cadet Prince joined HMS Collingwood in 1913 and served as a midshipman in the Great War. On the 4th of November, the redundant battleship Hms Hood was scuttled to block the South Ship Channel, the original gap in the breakwater, to prevent enemy submarines and torpedoes attacking through it. Such was the enthusiasm to fight for the country, the Navy found itself with far more reservist volunteers than they had ships for. In August 1914, the Admiralty therefore formed the Royal Naval Division. Enthusiastic recruitment campaigns brought a rush of volunteers, but the promise of play was rather wide of the mark. The gravity of war had not really sunk in by the famous Truce Christmas of 1914, when HMS Agamemnon held what they called a torture party at Portland. After an initial ill-planned deployment at Antwerp, the Royal Naval Division was hastily returned to England, where various temporary camps were established. One of these was at Portland, where the Howe Battalion bedded down in the Alexandra Inn at Wakeham. From there, the sailors embarked on intense trench-digging practice alongside the Portland Beach Road. The trenches were generally in a zigzag formation and up to 6 feet deep. After a few weeks, the Portland Court Leet complained that the trenches were left in a dangerous condition, but by then the battalion had moved on to their new training base at Blandford. The camp there was built quickly with its own church, hospital, canteen, railway line and station. These various naval battalions began their departures from Blandford in February 1915, and the men headed off for what was to be a terrible decimation at Gallipoli, where the carefully rehearsed trench warfare proved worthless. This is a rare view of King George V and Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, arriving at Blandford to inspect the Royal Naval Division before it set sail. One officer based in Blandford was Rupert Brooke, probably the most famous poet of his time, who penned these memorable words: "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." Brooke did die at only 27 from a septic mosquito bite, just one of 141,000 Allied casualties at the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign against the Turks. A memorial to this unique and tragic Dorset naval infantry stands at Collingwood Corner on the Salisbury to Blandford Road. Meanwhile at sea, the U-boat rapidly proved to be Germany's most dangerous weapon. The Great War brought serious merchant and naval losses off the Dorset coast. Here are some young sailors of the cruiser HMS Monmouth in, believe it or not, a temperance party at Portland. Their ship was sunk with all hands in November 1914. An early casualty was HMS Formidable of the Channel Fleet. On New Year's Eve 1914, west of Portland Bill, the sea was rough with the wind increasing, and she had just completed a gunnery exercise with the battle squadron. In heaving waves, a solitary German submarine, the U-24, launched a torpedo which struck home. After midnight, and with a heavy list, Captain Arthur Noel Loxley ordered the crew to abandon ship. Sea conditions were now atrocious, and in the blackness several of the ship's boats were smashed. At 3:05 a.m. Formidable was struck by a second torpedo, and then ensued a heroic rescue of 233 of the crew, many of whom landed at Lyme Regis. Here we see some of the survivors. Their smiling faces belie the fact that they had been rescued from horrendous seas in the dead of night, and having lost 547 of their crewmates. Captain Loxley stayed aboard to the last, and he went down, along with his faithful terrier Bruce. Captain Loxley was never seen again, but the body of his dog was washed up on Chesil Beach. The Formidable was one of the first British battleships to be sunk during the First World War. After her loss, the 5th Battle Fleet was removed from Portland. Portland Harbour was formerly designated a war anchorage and trawler station. Drifters and trawlers arrived to be fitted out for minesweeping, and later they were joined by motor launches based in Weymouth. Throughout 1916 and 1917, German U-boats continued to lay mines off the Dorset coast. The U-17 was a particular menace off Dorset. She laid at least 17 mines in the area between November 1916 and January 1917. Portland-based minesweepers had to constantly sweep a wide channel to keep a clear path through Weymouth Bay and the Portland approaches. On the 30th of April 1917, the minesweeping trawler Arfon struck a mine and exploded off St Albans Head, with the loss of 10 men. Numerous mines were swept and destroyed, including some near the Shambles lightship, off Anvil Point and in West Bay, where the dredger St Dunstan met her fate that September. In the heat of war there were many accidents. In January 1918, the submarine depot ship HMS Hazard was cruising off Dorset when she was rammed by a hospital ship, the SS Western Australia. The latter managed to rescue her crew. By the end of 1916, U-boats had sunk over 2 million tons of British merchant shipping and 24 warships. Cordite was a low explosive propellant which replaced gunpowder, and from the 1890s was extensively used in naval guns and rifles. Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, now insisted that the Royal Navy had its own independent supply of cordite, and an isolated but accessible site was selected for the RN Cordite Factory, the RNCF, at Holton Heath, Dorset. A special railway siding and water reservoir were constructed, and a jetty was built in Poole Harbour near the main site. The existence of this unusual naval site was kept a close secret throughout its existence, although up to 4,500 people worked there. As the Great War progressed, the British realised that the German high seas fleet based near Heligoland, with its vast arsenal of warships, had become almost invincible. Indeed, in February 1917, the Germans callously announced that they would use every available weapon without notice to sink every ship within shipping lanes such as the English Channel. But much of the Royal Navy was now in the North Sea. The situation for merchant shipping was desperate. 1 out of every 4 vessels leaving the UK ports was sunk. Merchant vessels were routed along selected approaches, but these were inadequately guarded, and the Germans soon learned the supposedly secret courses. They became death traps in which a U-boat only had to wait for the approach of its victims. On the 10th of May 1917, the SS Broomhill was captured and sunk off Dorset by a German U-boat. Tragically, 2 brothers, Jones, from Wales, went down with her, but the surviving crew were rescued and taken to Weymouth, where the master left this grateful message in a little album which has come my way. A few days earlier, 2 Norwegian coasters had met the same fate off Portland Bill. Their masters, too, wrote this note of thanks for the local hospitality. The catastrophic losses by U-boats caused even non-mariners to come up with desperate solutions. Before 1914, all the anti-submarine efforts were mechanical and often farcical. Lassoing periscopes and sliding a grenade down the wire, using towed grapples with dangling charges, and even lassoing the whole submarine with a noose of explosives. Even my grandfather, a master butcher, wrote to the Admiralty Board of Invention and Research on the 16th of December 1917, detailing his idea for vessels to be fitted with a retractable frame surrounding surface warships' hulls with screens of steel hawsers to cause the torpedo to rebound without exploding. The Admiralty politely declined his suggestion, but this picture shows how in fact they did adopt a remarkably similar device. The Admiralty Board of Invention considered many bizarre ideas for locating submarines, from training sea lions to warn of approaching enemy, to generating vast amounts of effervescent bubbles to lift lurking U-boats to the surface, where they could be picked off. There were reports that some trawlers were issued with bags and sledgehammers for putting over and smashing enemy periscopes. However, it was science that was eventually to match the menace. The difficulty of destroying submarines meant that only 7 U-boats were sunk in over 100 engagements in 1916. In response, First Sea Lord Admiral Jellicoe ordered intensive research. Researchers investigated using quartz piezoelectric sensors to convert the reflected sound waves into electricity, and developed the concept of underwater sound echolocation. The result was ASDIC, later to be manifested as sonar. In 1917, the Admiralty's anti-submarine strategy became centred on Dorset, and following a temporary set-up in Weymouth, a shore establishment was built on Portland. Pioneering detection systems developed here, and the introduction of convoys, changed the course of the war at sea. Using the new technology, many U-boats were destroyed in the channel off Dorset and elsewhere, and the number of merchant ships lost was drastically reduced. Over the next 70 years, the research and training establishments on Portland developed into a huge organisation, leading the world in torpedo and submarine detection science. Despite the enormous losses at sea, shipping was now being replaced at an impressive rate, especially after the United States became involved in the war. Even with their high strike rate, the submarines could no longer bring the country to its knees by stopping movement at sea. The Germans had lost the war on land by the end of 1918, and on the 11th of November 1918, the Flag Officer, Portland Command Area, relayed a signal to all units of the Royal Navy under his command, stating that hostilities will cease at 1100 hours today. Soon after the armistice, Dorset had a rare glimpse of American warships, when the US Battleship Division 9, under Rear Admiral William S. Sims on USS Wyoming, stopped by at Portland before sailing to rendezvous with President Woodrow Wilson on the USS George Washington, en route to the Paris Peace Conference. In Dorset, as everywhere, the huge sense of relief was tempered by the reckoning of the enormous cost of the Great War in terms of the unfathomable number of lives lost on land and at sea. Celebrations tended to be happy but muted. Fetes and peace teas were organised, as here at Tillicombe Farm on Portland. Bands turned out all over Dorset for many celebrations, as here at Weymouth. With the ending of the Great War, the Navy was scaled down radically, but the sea off the Dorset coast was a naval training and exercise area without equal. Anti-submarine research was continued apace at Portland's HMS Sarepta. Training squadrons and flotillas were based at Portland from 1919 down the years to 1981. Second in command of the P-31 of the anti-submarine flotilla in 1919 was the 18-year-old Sub-Lieutenant Louis, later Lord, Mountbatten. Anti-submarine technology was now advancing. On the 21st of April 1924, research became based on HMS Osprey, a shore establishment designated the Admiralty Underwater Detection Establishment. HMS Osprey research and training facilities expanded through the 1920s and 30s, and in 1933 the Admiralty decided to fit all new destroyers and submarines with ASDIC. Despite severe military cutbacks in the early 1920s, Portland was now an important rendezvous for the Atlantic Fleet, which spent the majority of its time here on exercises. The port had excellent coaling facilities, and the number of oil fuel storage tanks was increased. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Dorset coast frequently resounded to the sound of gunnery practice. When HMS Hood, the largest warship in the world, fired salvos, the boom of her guns could be felt in towns and villages all over the county. The 44,600 tons HMS Hood, which was to become one of the Royal Navy's most famous and tragic vessels, came to Dorset soon after her launch in early 1920. While at Portland later that year, she supplied Marines to form the Guard of Honour for the interment of the unknown warrior at Westminster Abbey on the 11th of November 1920, the same day that the Whitehall cenotaph was unveiled, for which Portland had supplied the stone. Like the rest of the country, Dorset was now at peace, enjoying the exciting new world of cinema, motor cars and recorded music. As yet, there was little sign of the looming depression of the 1930s, nor of the even greater war which was to envelop the world. The story of that conflict and Dorset's involvement with the Royal Navy through the rest of the 20th century is in Part 2.